conditions, some of the fuel vapor is vented, and fuel is vented through the rear of the aircraft. And this was causing some contamination in the area of the vent pipe. And what has happened is BAE Systems have acknowledged this, and they've now redesigned that pipe for our Hawk to move the pipe slightly longer, and that will be fitted by the end of the year. And this will then, again, solve that problem. So I was just trying to allude to that this is part of the OT&E and implementation process that is ongoing at any point in time. And we've so far had good cooperation in terms of solving those. Sorry.
General, these problems that you've alluded to, did it affect all the fleet of the Hawks?
In this case, all the fleet of the Hawks were affected on these. Sometimes you do find points or areas where only some aircraft are impacted. Well, then obviously it's not a design. Then it could be you sometimes get a batch of equipment. You buy a batch of spares, could be a batch of rotables, or you buy a fuel pump. Let's say you replace the fuel pump, and you find, but this fuel pump all of a sudden doesn't have the mean time between failure that you are used to. It's much lower. What would happen is you then query. We have a query service immediately straight back to the OEM. He will check with that batch, which is monitored all over. And then with other users, they'll come back and say, no, there's a problem with this batch. They will then go to the vendor and get it repaired for you at their cost, if that is the case. It could also mean that you have not handled that equipment correctly. You may have fitted because again, you've got technicians, you've got new people on the aircraft. So sometimes you might not be using or testing the equipment 100%, and so you find then it's a one-off now and again, and there is a proper technical committee that will sit with the contractor, Arms Corps, and the Air Force. And these are agreed with specialist engineers, whether it's now warranty, fix, is it a batch or not. So this happens on all aircraft types worldwide. It's not abnormal. And it happens on these aircraft as well. What I'm trying to show, I think, is that so far we've had some issues, we've had some challenges, but when we've gone back to the contractor, we've resolved it through the process. Thank you, Chair.
Now, were the Hawks grounded as a result of these problems?
There's a term stop fly that we use. This is when you stop flying the aircraft for cautionary. You could have an incident on an aircraft, and I'm sure you've heard that many times on airliners as well, and military aircraft. So the first thing you do is you stop flying. While you then investigate, and you go back to the OEM, let him check. He will then advise you to say he advises that you carry on flying, but may put some restrictions in place, which happened with the EU. They said, we'll check it, but just in case, do some extra checks on the engine before you take off and monitor in the air, and then it will be safe. We will then give that to our test pilots who will agree, and they say, fine, we'll carry on flying with restrictions. Or they may say, no, this could be more serious. Stop flying until we come back to you. But when you come to grounding a fleet, that is quite a serious decision, and that would only be taken either by the OEM's airworthiness, chief engineer airworthiness section. They will let you know. It could also be that they find out another fleet. For example, the minute that happens, by contract and by airworthiness, they have to inform all users. So you could find that they'll stop the Australian Hawks flying for something on our aircraft if it's the same as the one on theirs. And you may then find that both will be impacted. It could be the other way around. And we've had some examples of that. It happens on fleets, yes. So this could happen. But the other grounding could then be the Chief of the Air Force saying, although the OEM says to continue, we would advise him with our Military Airworthiness Board. So the Air Force also has a Military Airworthiness Board, which is chaired by our Chief Engineer. And our Chief Engineer would then, with this board, of which I would be part, we would make a recommendation to the Chief to say, look, although the OEM says carry on, we want you to stop rather and ground the aircraft for any safety reason. So because, and this is how it happens, I would imagine, certainly the Air Forces I've been exposed to, it's very much the same in all of them. So just to explain, that is the process that you would follow. So on the EU, we took precautions and we stopped flying, and then this restriction came out. We eventually learned to live with the restriction, and with the restriction, the new fitment will come. As soon as the new fitment comes, we lift the restrictions and we carry on. Typical things that happen on aircraft fleets from time to time.
General, we may proceed then to paragraph 47 and take us through.
answer. If you are unsure, then, as I said, you will go and possibly, yes. So at Tamada, the Hawks have been grounded for short periods while the investigation confirms. And then that's a decision, even though maybe the OEM or whatever said yes, we said no, we'll rather go to the second step of grounding for a while, make sure it's training aircraft, look at the situation. But in that case, again, if it was really urgent, then one could always lift that grounding. And that's a call you have to make with professional people who know about this matter. So, yes, to answer the question, sorry, I didn't finish with that. Chair, thank you.
You may now proceed to paragraph 47, General, and take us through the problems with the Gripen.
On the Gripen, we've had the ACR 500 radios, were also found to be a higher than normal failure component on the aircraft so far, but a solution has been developed and a modification to rectify the problem is underway at SAB's cost. It was able to be said that it was not meeting the contractual requirement on this one component. To be fair, though, I must say this component was a supplied radio, and the first time that it's flown in the aircraft. So it came probably from the fitment and the position and some of the aspects around the placement of the radio, and so that has been now a modification is underway, and this will be corrected shortly. So this did not impact on the aircraft stop fly or being grounded, but is something that we want to prevent, because otherwise later then it could become a higher cost driver on the aircraft, just to give an example. And this is the only case we've had on the Gripen so far, but again, we must say that the fleet hours are still quite low, so it would not be abnormal if, similarly to the Hawk, we also find some new, with the aircraft operating in our environment, there could be some areas of redesign or modifications or high MTBFs that are still coming, but we don't know yet at this stage. We are confident, however, taking this case and so far the workings that we have had with SAB as the contractor for Gripen, we are confident that they will similarly act responsibly should other cases arise. Chair, thank you.
This defect on this radio, did it affect the utilization of the Gripen at all?
No, it did not impact at all. As I said, it was quite a minor matter. It goes more about improving the mean time between failure than there was nothing wrong with the capability of the aircraft. It was just at a high failure rate that we were concerned about and wanted to fix as soon as possible. Chair, thank you.
Now let's proceed to paragraph 48 on page 10 and deal with the participation and the actual utilization of this equipment.
Thank you, Chair. I think I have covered the exchange that we have with the Royal Air Force pilot, and currently we are also members of the Hawk user group, where about 18 Air Forces attend. This is a user group that happens about every 18 months to 2 years. We've hosted one in Cape Town in South Africa, which was also very successful, and this gives an opportunity for our logisticians and our air crew and engineers to come together at a conference. They talk about the aircraft, they share experiences, they share common issues. They table these to the contractor and to the subcontractors, and obviously then also discuss possible common product improvements and upgrades. This is typically what happens, and most aircraft types in the military have these user groups, just to show that again, we are fully part of them, we're active partners in them, and in fact our crews have done very well at them so far. And similarly on the Gripen, where we have around 6 Air Forces operating the Gripen, currently, and hopefully that will grow shortly, and exactly the same happens on this user group. There's also a Volvo engine user group that we send our engineers to and our logistician, about 2 of them, and this happens every year or so, and that is a specific user group for all the people that operate Volvo engines worldwide. So again, an opportunity to share and to be part of the international community as part of the development and training for us for our new aircraft. Chair. Thank you.
Now, this exchange program with the Royal Air Force, does it occur in the UK or does it also occur in South Africa?
it occurs both ways. So we send an instructor to the United Kingdom, and they send one to us in South Africa on a swap. The tour varies between, it's generally been 3 years or around about 2 years, depending on the member himself, domestics and his career plan at the time. But it's a meaningful tour. It's a long-term tour. He takes his family with and moves over and operates in that Air Force, which is excellent exposure, not only from a flying perspective, but just from being in another Air Force, operating in a different part of the world and learning and feeding all that back. And, of course, he sends reports back regularly on, and he, of course, also educates them in this case. Our Hawk, which, in fact, up until about a year ago, they were still flying an analog Hawk, and now they've got their first digital Hawk, so he's been able to assist them. He was actually the ex-officer commanding of 85 Combat Flying School. So, yes, that exchange program is up and running and is both ways. Thank you, Chair.
Is it the same with the user group?
Sorry?
Where does that occur in terms of the exchange?
It rotates around the various countries. So we've had one for the Gripen and we've had one for the Hawk since we got the aircraft. And then it's been, on the Hawk, it's been going since about 1990, I think, or 1992. And the Gripen has been going now, I think we'll have our second one here, not next, but the one after that. So it's basically on a rotation. I can also add that on the Gripen, interestingly enough, I think the Swedish Air Force chief also introduced a Air Chiefs user group on the Gripen. And what happens is generally chiefs of Air Forces go to the two large Western international air shows every year, or at least alternate year, and that is the Farnborough Air Show in London, and the other one is the Paris Air Show. They are the two big, other than America and the Eastern countries. But at these two, there is a meeting of the chiefs of Air Forces of all the Gripen users as well. And that is for the chiefs only. And they discuss higher level strategic user group matters and bilaterals and a higher level than this user group that the pilots and the engineers go to. This does not occur on Hawk, but it occurs on Gripen, and I don't know how many other aircraft types do that, but it has been also a very meaningful engagement for the chief. And to obviously not to have it separate, most of them attend these air shows, at least one of them in every second year, so there's that opportunity to have a specific meeting to discuss Gripen operations within their air forces at that level. I think that's also been a positive. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, General. Let's now deal with the exercises on page 49 and also the use of the two flight test instrumented aircraft.
Yes, thank you, Chair. We have tabled pages 111 through to 115, which is a summary from our Air Force Command Post, who task our aircraft on our units and our bases. And I will only handle the Gripen and the Hawk. My helicopter colleague will handle the helicopter flying. But I think the purpose hereof is to show you, when I referred to the Hawk and Gripen taking part as part of the training and force preparation in exercises, multinational as well as joint with the other arms of services, and then our own Air Force exercises and operations. I'm not going to go through each and every one because many of them have happened 3 or 4 times over the period, but I think what we're trying to say is the concern that we have not utilized the aircraft. I think this hopefully shows that we have actually utilized them quite extensively in exercising. And our exercises are done, we train like we fight. In other words, you must train in the same way with the same doctrine, procedures, and environment as close as you can as you would in actual operations. And this is how the SANDF have done it since way back and continue to do so. And it's a very important element of training. Why? Because it takes the pilots and the ground crew and the whole unit together away from home base. So now they're not operating in their comfort zone. They're operating in another part of the country, different environment. They're operating from an airfield that they're not used to going into. They have to operate from there. They have to live there. They have to put on all the services. So everybody on the squadron goes. And these are also excellent esprit de corps and building opportunities to mold the fighting team, and also for the unit to compete against other units or to challenge themselves to meet deadlines, to be on the exercise. Because now they are being monitored and seen by the Navy, the Air Force, other countries. It ups the bar of your training largely. And in the military, this is very important. And really is something that we need to do on a regular basis, and we do so. In terms of the operations that the Gripen has been involved in so far, probably the main one so far was the Soccer World Cup in 2010. This tasking started to be realized in 2008 when the government was informed by FIFA that the government would have to sign a contract with FIFA to guarantee security of the Soccer World Cup in South Africa. This was the first time in my knowledge that FIFA actually insisted that the government, the president, signed the contract with FIFA to guarantee the security of the 2010 World Cup, and that was a new part of the contract and will be ongoing. And so obviously this was a large undertaking for the country to have to take, and so the Defence Force was tasked to make sure that this happens, and the Air Force was tasked to ensure then that the air protection of the Soccer World Cup was secured. And so we started in 2008 with a number of exercises, starting with a single point or a single stadium, building up to a number of stadiums in a single province, and then in 2 or 3 provinces, and finally in all the provinces at all the stadiums, where we had to secure the World Cup from an air safety point of view. We were not alone in this as the fighters. We obviously were an important component thereof. All of the assets of the Air Force, ground, air, and the whole of the Air Force took part in this as part of the South African National Defence Force effort, and I think Admiral Schultz alluded to this as well in his testimony, the role that the Navy played. It was in this exercise, during the practices already, and in the build-up, and then during the exercise, that I think we really started to understand, as I said, the capabilities of these new platforms that had the sensors, had command and control capability, and that the Hawk and the Gripen worked very well together as a combination to do the task. Because you can just imagine that we had to be in the air over all the games for an hour before, an hour during, and an hour after the game. Now, to do that in 9 provinces at about, I think it was 13 stadiums, if I'm correct, day and night. At the early stages, if you remember, there was a game, I think, at lunchtime, early evening, and late evening, and all of those had to be covered in a network of cover in the air. I can assure you it's the largest air campaign this country, in my 43 years, ever had to muster. It was massive in terms of on-station flying and doing. And bear in mind that at that stage, the Gripen was only 2 years into its delivery. We did not even have all the aircraft yet, but we had adequate aircraft, but we didn't have them all. So the Hawks also then, which had the aircraft delivered, also played an important role. And again, we saw the collateral role, where the Hawk could come in and, for example, do what we would call the point defense of the stadiums, closer in, and your Gripen was your more area, outer boundary type of patrol aircraft. And I can say that during the whole of the World Cup, there was not a single game throughout the whole of the World Cup where there were not Hawks and Gripens in the air doing their job to make sure that the Air Force, and in my case the combat line, did their part. And as I said, we were only part of this massive effort, but they delivered and they did the task. The deployability of the aircraft was proven, because it had to move from one game, land, move, fly to another province in some cases, and be at the night game and ready to go. The ground crew were transported in aircraft between all there to support the aircraft. Now, if you needed a large component of ground crew to cover such a wide area, this would not have been possible. But again, this brings in the much reduced number of ground crew that you require on these modern aircraft, because they were designed with deployability and logistics in mind from the start. And so what I call the tail to this system, we saw and we proved, is a lot smaller than we were used to before. And so the task could be done. And it was a very good exercise quite early because we could use all of those hours as well to tick off our operational test and evaluation in very, very realistic situations. Another very interesting aspect is for the first time these aircraft were safe enough. We actually were able to prove that they were safe enough to carry armament on civilian airfields. We were never able to do this before. Modern aircraft can do this. We also proved in the past if you armed an aircraft, you had to de-arm it when you put it in the hangar overnight. These aircraft have so many safety mechanisms built in that you didn't have to do that. Reduce the aircrew. You reduce the effort. You reduce usage of the weapon on, weapon off. This is what often in the past caused the aircraft to not get airborne because you overused the loading of the. Now the weapons can be put on the aircraft and it can be stored with those weapons. Really large improvements that were proven during the exercise. And the other important one, coming to one of the modes, the weather mode on the radar, which was delivered. There was one night I remember the aircraft were operating out of our base in Overberg. The Hawks also couldn't fly. The weather was really bad. No aircraft were able to land. No civilian aircraft were able to land at Cape Town Airport. The Gripens were able to fly. And I think that was a very big boost for the aircrew as well. The fact that we were able, with the correct equipment on board, to still be able to do the job and prove that we can do it in all weather, as I mentioned earlier. Because very often one would get the impression perhaps that we would only be able to operate in good weather because generally we have it. But we were able to prove there that even in the worst of Cape storms we were able to fly. So I think that was good.
Are you saying that without this equipment and capabilities, our eligibility to host the World Cup could have been compromised?
Yes, I think it could have been. It would have been. I think it would have been done, but I think we may have had to get assistance in some areas, and it would have been difficult to have done it all the time without this level of and type of equipment. And I'm sure the Soccer World Cup is not the only world event South Africa will be hosting. We've already seen the demand and the success that the country made of it, and so I think also in a small way, we've proven for the country, and we played our part therein, that South Africa is a country that can be relied on and reckoned with to host such a event and make sure that it is secured as a guarantee. And yes, I think we are well positioned for the future to do similar. Thank you, Chair.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Then Corona is the ongoing border patrol work that we do. And this we do not as a continual, Chair, obviously because the assets are high value, but from time to time, if the intelligence or the request from the land forces or intelligence or wherever required, then we do from time to time fly for these sort of operations when they need more high-tech capability. And the Gripen and the Hawk have partaken quite on a number of occasions in border patrol exercises and in this case operations, and then the others were a bit smaller, and then of course the recent one I think that is worthy of note is Vimbazela, which was the car deployment. I think we all know well the status which was arrived at there, and it was found prudent when the talks needed to take place and there could have been further escalation. Then assets were deployed by the South African Air Force in terms of the helicopters as well as the fighters. Of course, the transport is ongoing in support. They are always involved as well. And we deployed Gripens to an airfield in the theatre. Those aircraft were able to fly there with only one stop for landing. We did not use in-flight refueling because that would have had to be, allied in. But it was not necessary, and the aircraft reacted very quickly, and we were able to place the aircraft in theatre at short notice over very long range. And although not utilized, they returned fairly shortly there afterwards. But the fact remains is this is why I believe you have such a capability. When it is required by the country or in national interest at any time, I think this proved again that the system could deploy rapidly and at short notice and over a long distance without a very large logistics tail, because that in the past would have been a tall order, or you would have to pre-place the logistics, in which case what I'm trying to say is that these aircraft are more deployable at shorter notice than we have at previous. I think that is what we proved in that exercise. Then if we, in that operation, not exercise, that was an operation.
You referred to a theater. What is a theater?
Sorry, in military terms, the theater is then the area in which the operations or the conflict or the enforcement or the peacekeeping is taking place. DRC would be a theater. Afghanistan would be a theater in a NATO type. Yes, we refer to that geographical area in which operations are taking place. If we then move to the exercises, twice a year we have a weapons demonstration and display at our weapons range up at Rudderval near Mikado, where the aircraft throw live weapons, and with the army we type of have a mini war. We also have our executive national program, which is our senior course for staff officers and also other security cluster. They attend, our colleges attend, and then the Chief of the Air Force invites influence groups, as does the base OC, and we have a practice day and an actual day where we give the air crew, also importantly, the opportunity to fire live weapons close to, call it own troops, although they're friendly, and they are there for that purpose, but we have army on the ground and firing mortars, and it gives that opportunity, at least regularly, for the air crew, ground crews, and everybody to practice in between these other exercises that we do. And we then are able to exercise, but also to show the capabilities of the Air Force to our stakeholders. The Shields exercises were the build-up for the World Cup that I mentioned. Good Hope is an exercise with the German Air Force. They come down here and they use TFDC for some of their weapon releases. So they contract TFDC. It's much cheaper to do in South Africa, and we then take the opportunity, Chair, while they're here, to send some of our Gripens and Hawks, and we will do some exercises with the German Air Force. Excellent opportunity to work with a European Air Force again and be part of operations, and they do this every 2 years. There's also the Navy's involved with this Good Hope exercise as well, so it's not only multinational, it's also joint for us with our other partners in the South African National Defence Force. Both aircraft have taken part. Blue Cluster was an exercise which we held in 2011. This was a SADC exercise. There were 7 SADC countries that came and did the exercise with us. We did it in the Lowveld area at Mikado and at Hoedspruit. And this was an exercise for the SADC forces, multinational. And we had transport aircraft, we had command and control radar, we had helicopters, and we had the Hawks and Gripens take part as well. So they had an opportunity. The Zimbabweans brought their K9s down, and all the other countries brought helicopters and transport aircraft, and we had that exercise in 2011. Very successful, and we developed a joint doctrine for air power with the SADC countries, and this was an excellent exercise, and very gladly that my combat assets could also take part and my crews could take part. As we sit here, there's a similar exercise which Angola is hosting in Angola currently, and we have also sent some of our assets and our people there. Not this time the combat aircraft. This is a transport heavy one and a helicopter heavy one that is taking place in Angola. But just to show that this is not a once-off, this will take place every 2 years in a different SADC country. Again, another excellent opportunity for us to operate in the region with our colleagues and our partners in SADC and in various parts of Southern Africa. IPSAMA is with the Brazilian and Indian Navy. Again, it's a Navy-heavy exercise, but we take the opportunity with our assets, and we also partake with Hawk and Gripen. The next 3, Soboka and Glovu, these are mainly Army Land Force exercises at Luatla or at Potchefstroom with artillery, and here we get the opportunity to exercise with mainly the land forces, close air support, dropping bombs, live, working with the Army, to keep us ready for any joint operations that we may be called upon to carry out. And then a very special one for us was Lion Effort, Chair. This was a Gripen exercise hosted by the Swedish Air Force in Sweden. The Czech and Hungary Air Force, as well as Norwegian Air Force, also brought their Gripens. The Czechs also brought the L159. And so this was an exercise held in Sweden in February 2012. We were fortunate that the last 4 Gripens were just due to be delivered. So we delayed the delivery of the previous 2 to have 4 aircraft remain behind and take part in this exercise, because it was a golden one-off opportunity which we'll probably never get again. Because to get Gripens back, you can imagine, all the way to an exercise like that in Europe or Northern Europe would be extremely costly and a challenge. So we took that opportunity, and our own ground crew from 2 Squadron, our air crew, then went over, and the aircraft then were delivered straight from the factory into the exercise, flew the exercise. We did not miss a sortie. We flew all the missions that we were expected to fly. We had a few snags on the aircraft that our ground crew were able to repair, and 1 or 2 we got some help from Saab, because some were under warranty, which they then fixed for us, and we managed to then do that exercise in Sweden with the other air forces, with our own squadron, who went over and placed them there. I think it was an enormous opportunity, and we learned a lot, because here you had previously Eastern Air Forces who had experiences flying the MiG and the Sukhoi type of aircraft. You had the Swedes who had flown their previous aircraft and now the Gripen. The Thailand flies F-16s as well as Gripen. So you had air crews there who'd flown F-16s and sort of Western American. You had many of them had flown Mirage before. So this was an opportunity of comparative, although those aircraft weren't there, but in terms of tactics and doctrine. And I believe that our air crew and our ground crews did very well in the exercise, and they learned a lot, and a lot of the other air forces learned from us. So that was an excellent opportunity that was taken and flown in Sweden. Then we took part in the Aerospace and Africa Aerospace Defense Symposiums that we take part in. The air-to-air camps, this is what I mentioned, from time to time the squadron will deploy, because to do air-to-air firing, it has to take place over the sea. You can't shoot live weapons or rounds over the land. So we have 2 air ranges, one at Longabaan on the west coast and one at TFTC, and every year your frontline squadron will go down for about 2 weeks, deploy, and they will hone and train their air-to-air firing skills, both in various performance envelopes, and the Hawks do the same from time to time. So this is ongoing. Same with close air support with the Army and the Special Forces. These are exercises that we do on our own. Various fly pasts showing the flag and doing our part for various events, and they then follow. We were also part of the presidential inauguration fly past with the aircraft over Alexandria. Also, again, part of our outreach to our stakeholders. And then various, the Rand Easter show as well. At the bottom is where we also take part with the various aircraft. I'm not going to repeat the same for the Hawk, sir. It's exactly the same. The Hawk would then take part in its role in the same exercises, and you will see these spread throughout. There's nothing that stands out different between the Hawk and the Gripen. Both of them make use of these opportunities for these exercises. Again, to show that we have then utilized the aircraft in these various areas since delivery. Chair, thank you.
General, in respect of hosting of international events like the African Nations Cup and other similar events, the security issue, does it become important?
Yes, I believe depending on the size and shape and stature of such events, then the decision will be taken by a government that this is declared a high profile or a requirement that has to be met, and then the tasking will come down to the department and the SANDF, and if the Air Force is then needed to be part of that, then we will do the task. Perhaps I can just add, Chair, I think we've referred to joint ops before, and I'll come to the explanation of that. But whenever the aircraft are put into operations, then the Air Force gives those assets over to joint operations, and they utilize the aircraft, and they then fund those operations. Whereas if it is our own exercise that we are doing for the Air Force training, then it is part of our we then utilize and task the aircraft and fund it. If it is joint, then sometimes joint ops will also assist, or we will then carry it out, just to explain the difference between that part. But if it's full operations, utilization, then this is under the command and control of joint operations, which I think the Deputy Chief explained in his testimony fully. Thank you, Chair.
In exercises that occur overseas, do you take the ground crew along?
Yes, you deploy the squadron. You are one team. There's no I in team in an Air Force unit or squadron. You won't take everyone, but you will take the required members, but at least members from each mustering, because as I said, this is not just an aircraft, it is always a system. So you will always need someone from each of the components. And joining them from command and control will be the mission controllers and other Air Force experts that will come to assist them. The base, for example, will give certain people, they will give a safety officer and a quality control officer who will be detached to deploy with the squadron. There'll be a media person. When we went to Sweden, we sent a lawyer from headquarters because there could be international issues with legal, and this is all part of normal operations in an Air Force and Army and Navy. It's all the same. You take your unit and you get assisted by then additional staff from the organization, Chair.
And the utilization of the two flight test instrumented aircraft, can you deal with that?
Yes, I think I covered that fully before, mentioning that we use it, our local industry use it, sometimes overseas companies want to use it, and it's all done through formal contracting via either Arms Corps or our Chief of Finance Division. And we will then support it, and it's obviously then the costs are covered by the entity that wants to use that entity. We, of course, get the spin-off from it by having our people involved and flying the aircraft. Thank you.
We also get a spin-off in that we can generate capital from it.
Yes, so in other words, our pilots fly in some of these, and it's paid for by someone else, so I get more flying hours for my air crew, the ground crew get more practice, and also the important thing is that our test pilots and engineers, because ordinary, as I mentioned to you, ordinary line pilots do not utilize those aircraft. So it gives our test pilots exposure to a wider global test flying environment than they would have had that not occurred. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, General. Can you now take us through paragraph 50 on the ratio of force preparation versus force employment?
Yes, Chair. The ratio for the aircraft utilized so far, which we were requested to submit, gives the Hawk at 95% force preparation and 5% force employment, and then the Gripen is 94 and 6%. The bulk of the 5 and the 6 so far was during the World Cup, where they flew extensively in operations. As I alluded to, many of the missions that are flown under force preparation, however, are also in serving our clients and doing actual work for either our own purposes, the Defence Force, the department, or other departments as well. And just to explain the difference between the two concepts, if I may, force preparation is all continuation training flights of qualified aircrew at flying units. This is on page 116 of the evidence, JWB 11, page 116, Chair. And force employment is all tasking except flights as stated in paragraph 1 and 2. Hours flown for SAF participation in joint exercises are recorded by the SAF as force employment unless otherwise specified, as I said just now. So sometimes it will be with joint ops and sometimes ourselves will be force employment. Training is the basic flying training that you first do on the aircraft, and so you could see that training and force preparation is basically the same. The only difference is during training, he's not yet qualified on the aircraft. He's under instruction all the time. As soon as he qualifies what we call a type certificate qualification, he goes over to the force preparation part of the flying. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, General. Can you then take us through paragraph 52 and refer to JW 16 and 17?
Chair, here in the table on page 124 and 125, we were asked to submit the hours budgeted for each financial year between 2005 for the Hawk and current, and then for the Gripen from 2008 to current, which is on pages 124 and 125. On page 124, it can be seen then the hours that were budgeted for in the first column comes from the allocation to the system group, which comes down from the fiscus to the department every year, and then gets allocated to the Air Force. The Air Force then allocates it within its capability areas, and as Director Combat Systems, I am informed around about the previous year for the first time in May of the previous financial year, and again in November before that financial year, what is my estimated allocation. The final allocation is then done after the Treasury does their final government work, and I'm sure that my colleague from Chief Finance will be talking in more detail about this matter and the process. But to say that certainly by the end of the calendar or the end of December, before the next financial year starts in that April, I have my final allocation. That is the allocated funding for myself to go away and plan then to do the very best I can to utilize the system within that allocation. And obviously, in the beginning, when you first deliver the system, you are still under warranty. You are also just getting going. The flying is covered by the contract, with the contractor doing that flying. And so you find that earlier the budget allocation will be less and would then normally either grow or it would follow as would be normal in government budgets, up and down, depending on the departmental allocation, and in my case, the allocation to my system group. But what I can show from here is that the progression of hours that increased between 2005 from 125, when we first got the first one or two aircraft, very low obviously, then it grew exponentially to round about 2,000 hours in 2010, which was in line with the planning that we had done on the project, or very close to that. And then the rest of the build-up would have been dependent on the threat or the requirement at the time, when we, of course, did these predictions in early 2000, starting to prepare the Air Force for the first few years of flying from the project side. What happens is the full requirement, we table our full requirement during the Treasury and the departmental base. I don't want to go into great detail because, as I said, my colleague from Finance will be doing that. The bottom line is we put in our requirements. They are then looked at by Fiscus, and according to the decisions at government level and then department level, I get my allocation. And I then know that I can achieve a certain amount of flying hours, which is the baseline of our whole budgeting and planning system, to deliver those hours. Because if we're flying aeroplanes and we're flying hours, we can then gauge the level, the number of pilots we can operate flying at those levels, how many ground crew we need, etc., etc. As you can notice, what I've tried to point out, that over the years, we have in general exceeded our hours for which we started our planning against that allocation. What that implies is that in year, my requirement would have been higher, but my allocation allowed me then to say, well, if that's my allocation, I can plan to fly these hours. What happens in year, and again it will be explained, there are iterations in year where the Treasury and the own department reallocate funds between departments, and in the department between the arms of service or divisions, and even in the Air Force, the Chief of Air Force with his council reallocate money in year, either for reasons of problems with expenditure or other issues which I think is well known in the government and in departments. Now, I have every year, despite not getting my allocation requested in my full requirement, I have in every year been given some additional funding. And you can see this reflecting in the fact that in year then, my situation has been looked at and said, okay, combat will be given an extra amount of money at a point in time. Hence, the reason why I have said there, in some years with additional funding, I've either been able to meet the requirement or be very close to the requirement. Obviously, this is not only flying hours. Sometimes in year you get as you mentioned, the aircraft might have some damage that you need to repair. There could be other repairs that you have more aircraft that need repairs than you anticipated. Well, then you have to move some funds from flying hours into those repairs because they are important to be done. But in general, I can say that relative to the beginning of the financial year so far, I have been given additional funding in that year throughout. One of the anomalies is in 2006 on the Hawk. You'll see that we plan to fly 1480 hours as part of the build-up to our capability. I only flew 681. The reason for that is that due to the development on the Hawk of the avionics system, there were some of the deliverables that could not be delivered with the first set of aircraft, and so we had a certain avionics baseline at delivery, and the later aircraft came with the upgraded baseline, and we had to the other aircraft needed to have this avionics upgrade, and it involved taking some of the aircraft what we call line replaceable units or black boxes out, sending them down to ATE to be upgraded and sent back. Nothing abnormal for a newly developed avionics system, but that was the reason, and we said that why we flew less in that year than what we had planned to fly. In 2007, again, the upgrade was completed. In 2008, the reason there was we did not get additional funding in that particular year. So although we were hoping and planned on to fly 1,950 hours, we flew 1481. Still higher, however, than the year before. So important that we were still able to be ramping up at this point in time. The World Cup, of course, in 2011 gave us, in 2010, that large increase was because of the World Cup. And as I said earlier, that additional flying we did was funded by Joint Ops. So that came as funding from Joint Ops. So the more that the aircraft can be utilized by Joint Ops is actually to the advantage of my training in year, just to put that into perspective, because then I get hours paid for by joint operations to augment my hours and my flying. In 2010 and 11, we had some additional funding allocated, and in 2012 again, we flew more hours, and this was through some other savings that we were managed to generate within the directorate, as well as some additional funding from the Air Force. So in general, funding-wise, again, given what I was allocated, we have managed to exceed that allocation and fly more in most years on Hawk so far. But as you have seen, and I think this was alluded to by all my colleagues, that we know that after 2008 and the impact of the economy hit the country, it hit the fiscus, and we understand this in the military. And so we will have to take our fair share then of reduced budgets and funding challenges. And so we would have had to plan for that. But it's not like it's done at the last moment. We are given warning by Treasury and our department, and in my case, I get warning. I get a fair good idea a year before the time and then closer to the time of the allocation, and that gives you time then to plan to fit within your budget and cut your cloth to do your task. And that is the task that we have as directors in the various system groups. If we then go to page 125, Chair, you then see for the Gripen a fairly similar pattern starting in 2008. Obviously, the aircraft again have just arrived. The contractor is doing the training. Aircraft are being brought onto the line, and you start your initial training fairly low. We then were able to build up in the second year to just below the plan of 950. This was a little bit of getting used to the aircraft, and we mentioned there about some spares that went in warranty. And because the spares are in warranty, they all go back to the OEM. So there is a bit of longer lead time in turnaround, but of course they are repaired by SAB at that point in time. And so this is where we were still settling in and getting the aircraft settled in its environment. The next year, the Soccer World Cup, you can see again a large increase to our planned hours due to the Soccer World Cup. And again, we received that funding for employment from Joint Ops. In 2011, we we pointed out that it was important because our hours that we were able to afford, as you can see, we took quite a knock in terms of allocation to combat systems in 2011. But we had an unexpected year in terms of aircraft serviceability. It was just one of those years that went well. And also, we were able to spend more money on fuel than replacing spares in that year, because we had a very good serviceability rate at that stage of the aircraft, and thus the higher output. But also we did receive some additional funding for operational test and evaluation. The reason being that we were concerned that if we did not fly these extra hours, we would not achieve the operational test and evaluation adequately to take back to the contractor to address. And so the department and the Air Force found some extra funding for us to achieve that. So I'm trying to allude to this is a continual balancing of resources. It will always be scarce. We understand that. And so we have to live with the fact that some years I will get additional funding. In another year, the helicopters might be a higher priority, or transport in the Air Force or in the arms of service. And this is an ongoing process that is a reality that we live with in our domain. For last year, in 2012, we came very close. I got funding and I planned on the hours, and we flew those hours, as you can see. And normally we use a ballpark of around 10% for our reporting on our annual reporting plan into the system is acceptable. So I didn't give a reason there for the additional hours on that. But one can see that with the hawk that was building up, it built up quite quickly to the 2,000 hours in, call it, the good years. But since then, like all departments, and funding has got tighter, the hawk started to slow down that ramp up and had to then reduce. The Gripen did not hit that point, because as the Gripen was delivered in 2008 is when the pressure came on the budget, and you found then that we were fortunate to have the operations which helped us to at least keep a fairly steady increase in hours. But at the moment, again, we know that we are in a fairly tight time. So that is just to put in perspective, also to show that the aircraft have all flown. There's no aircraft that haven't flown at all, some more than others, and the reasons why and how the difference between what is reported in the beginning of the year and then at the end of the year in the actual flown, and the deltas and the reason for that, Chair, as requested. Thank you.
Thanks, General. So it appears that the number of hours that you fly will depend mostly on what Treasury allocates to you per annum.
Yes, that is correct.
Can you now take us to paragraph 53, where you are dealing with the average cost per flying hour over the last 3 years as approved by National Treasury? That's on page 10 and 11, paragraph 53 and 54.
Chair, I'll just request a moment, Jeff, to my paper shuffling. I'll be with you in a second. Sorry.
Page 10 and page 11, paragraphs 53 and 54.
Yes, Chair, we were asked to give the cost per flying hour and an explanation for that in our submission. And here I've shown then the flying hours that were carried out on average over the last 3 years in the table on page 10, in the table at paragraph 53. Just to say that the cost of our flying per hour is submitted and approved by Treasury, and then this is a standardized rate that is used for all departments and for our own purposes. So on the average of the flying hours over a period of 3 years. The dry cost, which is without fuel, you've got a dry cost on an aircraft and a wet cost. The only difference is the wet cost is with fuel. And the dry cost, and that is normally how our Treasury wants it to be submitted. And that then gives the total flying cost per hour for the aircraft over those hours, average for the last 3 years. If one would go then to paragraph 54 on page 11, I allude to the fact that the aircraft earlier were in the URS designed to fly an average of 4,000 and then 3,600 hours once reaching steady state. For the Hawk, that should have been in round about this time, and for the Gripen in round about 2016. And the ramp-up would normally be fairly even. This, however, remember, is for an average over 40 to 50 years of flying, and would then obviously vary between times of conflict, times of peace, times of ramp-up training, times when you have to perhaps slow down, as we do at the moment due to constraints. And often flying hour or cost per flying hour becomes an issue for many causes and cases. It's no different in all air forces. I'm just trying to show, though, that you will have, many people say, but the aircraft is very expensive to fly because it costs the costs it does. As we said, these assets are expensive. However, the more you fly them, the lower the cost per flight hour becomes, because your fixed cost stays more or less the same. What varies then are your variable costs, which is normally your repairs will be higher, but your fuel usage is also higher, but you amortize it, of course, over many more flying hours. So your fixed costs, what's in this sort of game of high-tech military equipment, your fixed costs are normally higher, or a lot higher, as you can see, than your fuel costs. In the case of the Hawk 22 verse 15, and then the Gripen, your dry versus your wet cost is higher. So the more you fly, the less the cost per flight hour, I think, is all that we are trying to illustrate in these two tables to you. This also impacts then, as I said, on the lower versus higher flying rate, and so therefore the ratio of Hawk to Gripen cost, if you take that ratio, is roughly around about 37% of my budget towards Hawk and 63% towards Gripen. This then again gives some idea of the cost difference between a lead-in fighter trainer, or call it aircraft of that category, versus a Gripen, which sits at around about 63% of my budget that I need to expend then for the Gripen to reach its flying system. We believe that once we are fully handed over, this ratio will be around about 30 to 70%, and by comparison of other air forces and other similar types of aircraft, this is a normal ratio. This is not an abnormal ratio. It doesn't mean that one is largely more expensive than the other in terms of operating, if we benchmark with the other Gripen and Hawk users that are currently flying the aircraft. An interesting point I'd like to point out is we need to add to this challenge for the Air Force and, of course, the Navy as well, the challenge of aviation inflation, Chair. Aviation inflation last year was 14%. This is against a CPI of 6%. And this is a challenge because you do not always get compensated for that delta in terms of allocations. And so this is also not only prevalent in the military. I'm sure if you go to see our airlines and local aviation and international aviation, they will tell you the same, that aviation inflation is considerably higher than CPI inflation or most other industries, mainly driven, again, by the fuel, which, as you can see, is a large consumer of cost on aircraft. And so I just thought I would like to point that out to the Commission to gain some better understanding of some of the challenges which we live with. And then I did also submit JWB 12, which just shows a graph of the change in the fuel price since the 90s through to present, to show that large increase in that cost factor, which makes up roughly close to half of the cost of us flying our aircraft each hour, by way of clarification, Chair. Thank you.
JW 12 on page 117.
That is correct.
You're saying that the fact that we're not flying our design 2 hours for the 2 aircraft has an impact on the amount per hour that is spent.
Yes, as I said, because of that ratio that I've explained, the more you fly, the lower the cost per flying hour. It doesn't mean the aircraft is cheaper, because you still have fixed cost. It's still a cost to the system. But if you turn that around and ask the question, if you need to maintain these systems, the integrity of the system, you need contracts with your contractors, etc. Your fixed cost is a given. You have to then expend your funds first to secure that. The remaining of your funds goes into flying hours. So if your funding and your budget comes under pressure, in our case of the Air Force, then normally the tail end of the costing will be your amount for fuel, which is then your amount generated into your flying hours. So then you will find that your flying hours will have to be limited, and then you have to then package your training for that year and your utilization for that year to be in line with that. And hence, at the moment, with the lower allocations that we are all aware of, I'm sure, then the flying hours are less than what the system can fly, and certainly what we would be capable of flying had that been greater. But again, we understand that, and we need to plan for it, and we need to do it professionally and make a plan in order to live with that situation, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, General. Can you just take us to the austerity measures that you've implemented in the 2013 and 14 financial year?
Chair, as I said, we know before the time if it is going to be, and we were warned that this would be a particularly tough financial year, 13, 14 financial year. And so we were all asked by the Air Force and by the Chief of Defence Force to look at austerity measures. In the combat line, the first austerity measure that I realized was that I would not be able to retain all of my aircrew on the 2 platforms that I had trained so far. And so that was one aspect. The other one was the need to find a way of reducing the amount of aircraft that we would put on the line every day in order for us to live within that allocation. And thirdly, to manage the risk of doing these actions. And so we did planning before the time, during last year, to prepare for this. I can say on the aircrew side, what we did is we made sure that all the aircrew who were still under conversion training in the various levels that I've explained, we first secured that we would complete those training courses. The reason for that being that if you don't complete that course, then you will have to repeat that full basic training if you stop that course, which is one option. We did not do that. We made sure that we first finished that course. That means that the pilot is what we term type qualified on that aircraft. He can safely fly the aircraft in the air in all its basic modes. He may not yet be able to do all of the operational roles, but he is converted. To then bring him back later, if he's been, and it could be ill for a long time, he could have to go on instructor's course, he may be given a ground tour. We also send our aircrew on ground tours up to the operational areas, etc. When he comes back to that platform, he only has to do what we call a refresher course, which is much shorter than, as you can imagine, an operational conversion course, probably around about 25%, 20 to 25% of the hours required. So we made sure that everyone that had commenced a course, we planned to finish their course, and I can say, sitting here today, in the year, we managed to achieve that. Then we took some of our qualified, more senior aircrew, and what we did is we moved them down back on an instructor's tour on the Pilatus PC-7 with some of our younger aircrew who were qualified but did not carry on flying on Hawk, and we've placed them at a flight doing advanced flying on the Astra so that we keep our young pilots airborne, flying, and active. This will even further reduce the jump back when they come back to the Hawk because they are already prepared. But that is a fact. It was prepared for, and we have done that. And we've kept the core of pilots then on Hawk that were required to do so. We have adequate pilots on Hawk currently to feed the Gripen. And so this has not impacted on a feed-through onto Gripen, and in fact we qualified another pilot from Hawk onto Gripen in the last year, as well as a navigator, because the navigator and the pilot go onto the course, they do the same course as well. So we did not totally stop throughput onto Gripen to ensure that we also did not impact on our frontline operational capability. What we did do is we also then sent aircrew who were eligible for instructor's course, because as I said to you earlier, all aircrew, fighter aircrew go and do instructor's course at a point in time, because you need to start to prepare them to become pilot attack instructors. So we took some of our Gripen aircrew and we moved them onto instructor's course, two members from there and 2 from the Hawk, slightly earlier onto instructor's course, so that they would also then get going with that course, keep flying on Astra, gain a qualification, and they could then come back earlier to become PAIs and Hawk and back to Gripen. So without going into great detail, Chair, I want to assure you and the country that this was not done without a lot of planning and a lot of sensibility, taking into cognizance the realities of what we need to achieve, but not impacting on our frontline capability within line of the current requirements from Joint Ops and the department, but slowing down a little bit the training, but not stopping young pilots from flying, allowing them to continue flying on another platform and bring them back. Then the remainder of the reduced Hawk pilots continue on Hawk and fly at the hours as allocated and continue to operate. That was the aircrew austerity measures that we took. The second measure that we took, and has probably been reported on a lot, and is probably quite a difficult one to understand, and I hope to clarify this today at the Commission. And this goes about the aircraft management of the fleet in these times. What we realized, as I said, is, and I think we have alluded to that, the Navy and the Deputy Chief, that you operate fleets of aircraft at levels that are required to do a task given a scenario. It's not that you don't get warning from Joint Ops and everywhere else. So you will tailor your assets and your requirements so that the Air Force also doesn't allocate money to combat when there are other urgent needs to be met that need to fly every day. And currently I accept as combat that my helicopter compatriots and my transport colleagues, they are out there doing jobs every day, which I am not doing every day. So therefore they will get a bigger slice of whatever cake. This is normal. It's no different, I can assure you, to many of colleagues I've spoken to worldwide, east, west, everywhere. There have been massive cutbacks in defense and similar measures, and we have shared some of these ideas with our other Air Force colleagues, as one does. And we are not alone in doing what we are doing at the moment. So I would like to refer then to a document that I have submitted on page 118, and I would just like to read it, and if it could be noted as such by all, that this is the status, that we call it, and it is the same for Hawk, Gripen and Hawk, Aircraft Preventative Maintenance Cycle. And to give some background, that during the first quarter of 2013, Director Combat System investigated the possibility of inhibiting or putting into long-term storage, as the term is, certain of the Gripen aircraft. At the time, the number was 12 that we identified, and that has been reported in the media, and the Minister did report on it in March in Parliament. But during engagement thereafter with the original manufacturer being Saab, with them, we worked on a more effective and less costly process was agreed to, reducing the number of maintenance activities required for storage and making the aircraft more readily available for flying. We found out, being new aircraft and modern aircraft, and we have looked previously on fleets at long-term storage, that both these aircraft, it would be far more costly and require much more maintenance putting them into long-term storage than determining the minimum time, days in fact, and we know the exact days now, of how often, if you just fly that aircraft, get it airborne, generate the systems, you reduce largely the maintenance and the cost of that storage. This was not known to us before, and with older generation aircraft, this was not necessary so and endorsed by the manufacturer. So starting with the Gripens, we then supported a statement by the operator from Saab and then embarked on what we call a rotational preventative maintenance program to better retain the fleet system integrity. Because what is very important is not to lose your integrity on any aircraft, your airworthiness, and if you can fly it every now and again, means that your ground crew are practicing on it, the air crew are flying it, and one is able to continue. We also placed the aircraft that was identified in tents inside revetments to prevent corrosion. These are tents that are dehumidified to ensure that you prevent any corrosion, external damage to aircraft, and you strictly control the environment in which the aircraft are secured. I know it's easy, and I've seen many diagrams and statements about aircraft standing and in various states of status. I can assure you this is not done without engineering and logistic professionalism and properly. And so, as this extra measure ensures, because when aircraft do stand, it can be that they can have damage. We have, before, as many air forces, you have often, sometimes, rodents that can get into an aircraft. They can eat wires and cause havoc on aircraft. This happens. So by doing this, we have taken measures to ensure that this does not occur. And so all 26 aircraft will therefore continue to be flown and managed in accordance with this procedure, and the same, if necessary, for Hawks. The other advantage is now serviceable aircraft can be removed from the RPM maintenance program and be available on the flight line within 2 days, as opposed to going into long-term storage, where it would take a long time to get this aircraft out. And hence the reason why recently, I'm not sure if it was last month or in June, we got another inquiry as to how many aircraft are in long-term storage, and the answer was none. So there are no Gripens in long-term storage. Gripen fleet is in this process that I've tried to explain now, which is, I don't think one needs to debate it, is clearly a much more cost-effective and efficient way of maintaining the fleet in times when you do not require all your aircraft for utilization and training. Thank you, Chair.
General, you are referring to a letter dated 16 August 2013, which was addressed to the Chief of the South African Air Force, which has been signed by yourself. Am I correct?
Correct, sir.
There's also terminology called mothballed. What does it mean?
Mothballing is basically long-term storage. In other words, what happens is, I'm sure most people have seen pictures in America of the Nevada desert. They have conditions there where the United States Air Force, when it had thousands and thousands of aircraft standing in disposal, or that they could not fly, they just parked them in the desert. And because of the conditions, they can be stored there, those type of aircraft, taken back, but then the cost to get them back into flying is very high. Many air forces have gone into long-term storage. On the older aircraft, it was necessary. We also stored the F-1s when we phased them out for quite a long period while they were in the marketing phase, and they also had to go into this long-term storage and then be brought out. However, in this case, due to the type of aircraft and engagement, we believe we found a much more cost-effective and efficient way of doing the same, but through this rotational process, Chair. And also, I think to add to that, the fact is that it is so that funding can also change at any time, because the situation can change at any time. And as we've shown here, should that be the case, then we can rapidly take those aircraft back out and put the number of aircraft required onto the flight line, Chair.
What about the Hawks? Are you using the same process in respect of the Hawks?
We'll use the same process for the Hawks, yes.
Now, this underutilization of the Gripens, does it affect the intake of new recruits for the Astra?
Similarly to where the combat line will have, call it, slowed down. Similarly, the other lines also have challenges, and therefore, naturally, you will train less pilots. But the big thing is not to stop. If you stop, as I explained yesterday, which happened to us in 2003 to 2005, when we phased the Impalas out and had to live through. Fortunately, we still had the pilots flying the Cheetah at that time. But that took about 4 years to recover from that. So this is something you really don't want to get to. So we will not stop. We will continue to train, but at lower levels, in line with the allocations, just like many other air forces adapt to the situation. Yes, that is so.
And does this also have any effect to the strength of the technical personnel, SAF personnel, and the morale?
In terms of technical personnel so far, no. There is a turnover of technical personnel. But again, the personnel, remember I said, can also move to be trained on other aircraft types, or between the two, or also go back to the ASU. And in general, again, in these times, you will never be fully manned. So it's not like you are having excess ground crew. You have adequate ground crew. And like I said, in this process, fortunately, we still require, and those ground crew will still be doing the tasks, getting the aircraft ready to fly, servicing the aircraft in the hangar while it is in this rotation. The maintenance continues on the aircraft at a normal rate on the ground. So your technicians keep practicing, so we do still need them. Also bear in mind that squadrons and units, Chair, do not just fly. There is enormous amount of work that has to be done and tends to get behind when you have periods of high flying, and that is the writing of doctrine, SOPs, further training. We can now get our young aircrew to do certain of their developmental courses. This is what you do in times when your flying rates are lower. You train them, you send them on their other courses that they need to do, so that when your flying hours need to increase again or are able to increase, then they've done that training, and you can put them back again and ramp up and train faster. And this is not the first time in this Air Force in my 43 years that we have been through this. We've been through it 3 times. As I alluded to the cuts in 1990 and in 97, similar actions had to be taken. So this is not an abnormal thing to happen in the longer life cycle of a system, in my view, Chair. Thank you.
Now, what would be the effect if we would have disposed of these 12 Gripens other than to put them through this rotation process?
No, I don't. Sorry, I don't understand the question. Could you repeat the question?
I'm saying, in terms, could we permanently dispose of this 12 Gripens other than putting them through this rotational process?
You used the word could, and anything is possible. However, I think, again, we come back to the question of do you have a need for a capability or not? Over 40 or 50 years of operating the aircraft, those numbers were determined. They were below the force design of 1998. Should the current force design process currently underway perhaps come to the conclusion that a different number is required, it could be the same, it could be more, it could also be maybe slightly less, then that, I imagine, would be considered only at that point in time. I don't believe that the military is in the game of reacting rapidly to such changes. We know these changes, we know conditions will change, conflict will change over time, and therefore we believe and strongly believe then that these are the right and correct numbers to meet the requirement over the life cycle of the aircraft. But that is not a decision for myself. That would be a decision that I, as I pass to, would be done through formal review and certainly be taken at governmental level, and would not be a decision, certainly not at my level, but much higher. Chair, that's all I can answer to, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Can you just take us through paragraph 57, where you are indicating that the South African Air Force has an excellent, well-balanced and well-equipped fighter system capability within the ideal 3-tier system?
Yes, I see this more as a concluding statement where I allude to the fact that I think we have been delivered by the government and by the project an excellent, well-balanced and well-equipped fighter system. It's capable within the chosen three-tier system. It's ideal, I say, because the gap between the first and second tier aircraft, between the first and second tier aircraft is large, and the tier between the second, in other words, between the Hawk and Gripen, is a smaller gap. This is ideal in any three-tier training system, and this is what was delivered to the Air Force. The Hawk has also proven to have a cost-effective collateral operational capability, as I alluded to in many of the operations and exercises that we've seen, and can be packaged with the Gripen, which is, in our term, a force multiplier with the two aircraft. The training success rate has also been very high for aircrew. We have had very few aircrew that have not passed the Hawk course to go on to the Gripen, and we've also proven that this is from various backgrounds and from both genders. The Gripen has exceeded, I would say, the SAF and SANDF's expectations, especially in the domain of modern fourth-generation integrated systems, deployability, logistics support, and reach. The Hawk and Gripen aircraft has also solved many of the past problems experienced with hot and high operations, mainly thrust, also cooling and communications. Perhaps I should expand on the cooling. Again, due to these modern engines, which can bleed off more air to feed the aircraft systems than previous engines, you can cool the aircraft avionics systems and the pilot in the cockpit to a far greater degree. And we have always in the past struggled with these two elements. And as you know, electronics don't like heat. They have to be controlled. And these aircraft have large avionics systems in, and therefore the cooling demand on the aircraft is very high for the systems as well as for the aircrew. And these have been overcome with these two aircraft by having the engines that they do have. And it is quite a factor, because if you are flying in certain operations, as happened in the World Cup, where the aircraft were airborne for up to 3 hours at times in the air, in sometimes fairly hot conditions, although it was winter, but some of the games were in Durban with high humidity. You can imagine the fatigue that would then be on the aircrew over those 3 hours in the air if the cooling was not efficient. So it is quite an important aspect that has improved. So I'm sure if I had to ask any of my pilots who flew the previous aircraft, these three come up. And lastly, clearly the Hawk and Gripen systems have, I believe, been well utilized since delivery, in line with the current security requirements and the funding allocations which have been allocated to the Air Force. Should the security environment change, however, to one of conflict, then the utilization of the systems will change as and when required to defend and protect the Republic in line with our constitutional mandate. And so, in these times of requirement and security situation, this situation is managed, I believe, as best as possible to meet those requirements, Chair. Thank you.
So would you say also that these underfunding challenges, they've not affected the capability of the South African Air Force to meet the constitutional mandate?
With the current requirements given to us by joint operations as to their requirement currently, those can still be met by the Air Force. However, if we sustain these lower levels of funding, there will come a time when training and renewal will become a problem. But perhaps I can, at the moment, the allocations which I currently have and will receive in year will allow the aircraft to be operated at a higher utilization rate over the next 3 years. My allocations currently, remember I said they're estimated, there could be other cuts that come through the process until next year. But currently, as predicted by the department all the way down to me in combat, was that this was going to be a tough year. And if I look at my allocations over the next 3 years, they are higher each year than I have had this year. So in terms, and I say again, these are current estimations according to normal process in the department, this could change. Should that be the case, then I believe with the austerity measures that we have taken, the next 3 years will see a gradual recovery from the situation that we currently find ourselves in. To add to that. That is the current status as we have it, Chair. Thank you. Perhaps I can just add, it wasn't asked directly, but has also been reported on regarding contracting, just to confirm that the Hawk system is fully contracted for what we call steady state support. The Gripen system was on contract until March of this year. We did have a challenge in year, because when you go from what's called the interim support contracts to steady state contracts, there will be an increase in those contracts because you no longer are supported by the project and warranty and all of those matters. We have had a challenge in year with SAB, not only financial but some other contracting, but we are confident that we will be on contract by the end of this year. Be on contract on support contracts on Gripen, in line with the expected improved funding, so that we will not only be on contract, but we can start to increase flying hours as of the following financial year. Those are the facts as I have them at the moment, Chair, in terms of utilization and funding. Thank you.
Now, General, in the event that the Commission recommends the cancellation of these contracts, what will be the impact on you as the Director Combat Systems?
I think the impact, first, if I can start on the impact on the country and the impact on the department and the Defence Force, because it will not be able to meet its constitutional mandate and the requirement which is there for the Air Force to meet its airspace protection and defence capabilities without a fighter capability. Secondly, I believe, as alluded to before, that a fighter system is a national asset. It is not only there for conventional conflict and to defend and protect, but is also part of the country's national power base, which the whole Defence Force forms part of. And therefore you will lose, again, an element of that national power in terms of insurance policy, in terms of deterrence, and in the projection of stability in the region. And as alluded to by my colleagues, I think we have a view in the South African National Defence Force that South Africa is a regional, even continental, and if I may even proudly say global player, in its own small way with alliances. Then I believe to have a balance of national power and Defence Force capabilities, it's essential to have a fighter capability. The other challenge would be that if you did not have this capability, then you would lose the very key tenet of air power in terms of precision firepower and high munition firepower. And you would therefore lose a key element of an Air Force and of a National Defence Force, and create an imbalance in that environment relative to the other capabilities of the country and the Defence Force. So I believe it would be an extremely serious decision that would have to be taken regarding this matter. And then lastly, to say that if you lose such a capability, as I've referred to earlier, you will have a long period in order to replace it, should you replace it. If you do not replace it very soon, and even if you had to try to replace it now, the costs would be extremely high, I believe, and you will also lose that capability and have to retrain and ramp up that whole capability again. And I have given examples of where even at short times, what that impact was. You can virtually double the time that you don't operate as the time it will take you to ramp up, as I would imagine in this specialist area, that is how long it would take. So in terms of the recovery of the capability, this will not happen easily in terms of time and cost. And lastly, obviously, I think it would be a major impact on the people and the esprit de corps of the Air Force as a whole to not have these capabilities throughout, and equally in any of the other arms of service as well. Chair, thank you.
What about the local industry, General?
Yes, you alluded to that. Outside of that, of course, the local industry, as you heard on Hawk, is heavily involved, and on Gripen the same. And so you would find that if those capabilities were then not retained, then the local industry likewise would certainly be impacted. And if your own Air Force is not there to support you and operate systems and that which you produce and support, then we've seen in the military game that it is quite difficult then to also stay in business and sell those capabilities to other clients worldwide. So I believe that there would definitely in the defense industry be an impact as well. Chair.
What about hosting major international events?
Yeah, I think again you will if there's certainly a guarantee required and a concern around security, which I think there always would be at such events, then the role that was played typically in the World Cup would not be available, and therefore it could be that such events may then not be able to be hosted in South Africa, or would have to be some other form of security would have to be then co-opted in to support that capability for such events. Chair.
Does the visits by eminent international leaders also require security in the sense of your capabilities, Air Force capabilities?
That's probably more a question for the security cluster level, and I would not answer to that. But in my opinion, I can't give a definitive answer, but in my opinion, if this was the case for such an event as the World Cup soccer, then there will be other events similarly. And normally when heads of state travel, if it's, for example, I can give an example of a G5 or a G20, I think is maybe a prudent example worldwide, and South Africa are part of that. If that had to take place in South Africa, then yes, not to the degree of the World Cup, but you would certainly need to ensure safety in the airspace and in the defense force to cover that, and that would not be possible then because you would have a gap if you did not have a fighter capability, in my opinion. Chair.
Thanks, Chair. That concludes the evidence of General Bain.
Is there anybody who wants to cross-examine General Bain? Thank you. Dr. Madima, the usual.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. There are several issues that were raised during General Bain's evidence in chief, and we would request that we be afforded an opportunity to consult with him before we re-examine him. We are just a little bit
Dr. Madima, General Bain is not your witness. He is the witness of the commission. He was called by the evidence leaders. I'm not quite sure if that is the position, whether you can consult with him before you re-examine, if he's not your witness. It's just something which came to my mind, just after you requested that, probably we should wait until tomorrow morning. But then the question which I'm asking is, can you consult with him if he's not your witness?
Thank you, Chair. General Bain is our client, and we just want to make sure that whatever we re-examine him on is not classified, it's not something that he shouldn't be saying. So that if indeed it is, if it is classified, for example, we will not re-examine him on that, even if we seek clarity or we want him to expand on what he said in chief. I don't think that there is any problem with us consulting with him, well, consulting quote unquote, with him in that regard, as long as the evidence leaders are not opposed to that. And I don't think they would be opposed to that, because even during the currency of his evidence, we were able to talk to him during breaks.
Dr. Madima, they are here. I'm sure they can talk for themselves. Let me find out from them if they will object or not. Advocate in power?
Chairperson, we don't have any objection. We may be present during the consultation just to make sure as to what are the issues raised.
Okay, thank you. Then in that case, that can be done tomorrow morning. And General Bain, you're excused for the time being, and we'll start with you again tomorrow morning at 9:30. But then can I make this request? As Advocate Mpara said, I think he needs to be present during those consultations. Is that the arrangements?
That is indeed the arrangement, Chairperson.
Thank you. Then we'll adjourn until tomorrow morning at 9:30.
Tell me, how do you feel about the fact that in South Africa, with so many women, apparently there's only 3 women who are fighter pilots? Tell me your feelings about that.
Well, my name is Dikele Dimodise. I don't think it's fair because there are a lot of women in South Africa. I mean, there are some women that can do it. Women power, I mean, we go forward.
Yes. Okay. A person like you, would you like to take a job like that?
I would love
Definitely.
to. I would love to. I mean, why not? It's a free country. We as women can do what men can do.
Yes.
We got that ability, we got that power and that strength.
Yes. And this is really so unfair.
Okay. Oh, all right. The thing is very exciting about flying a plane like that and going on missions,
Yo, it will be very much exciting because it's a man's thing. So for women, yes, it will be at least more exciting because as you have seen.
It's a main thing. There's not. Angitshele wena uzizwa kanjani ngale ukuthi ku-Air Force kunabafazi phela abathathu abafly lama plane bathi ama-fighter jets.
Yeah, khona towards gender, it's not fair. At least bangazama keep a post for only women, specifically for only women, so that we can apply, and at least maybe increase the amount like
ukuthi ku-Air Force kunabafazi kuphela abathathu abafly ama-fighter jets.
The wings zakhona, it's like it's in abafazi, they don't pay too much attention kithi. So at least mabangazama keep a post for women only specifically, at least ngabangcono. Maybe the amount increase for thina abafazi ukuthi at least basebenze to that Air Force, yeah.
I-plane efasting kakhulu, sometimes thola ukuthi bakuthumela kuma-mission bathi Mozambique or Iraq, uzizwa ukuthi wena ungahandle?
Yes, mina ngahandle because speed like into engithandayo, so I can qualify. So I have that confidence ukuthi ngakhona.
Okay, can you say the last part but in English about
for me?
No, wait. Send you on mission, say to Mozambique or Iraq to go and bomb something and come back quickly. Would you be able to handle something like that?
Yes, I will be able because speed for me is a simple thing. I like.
No, just
I will be able because on my own.
No, it's good English, man.
On my side, I will be able because I like speed and I have a confidence. And I think I can manage. Speed for me, it's a good thing. It's my favorite thing. I can manage.
And you?
I mean, we got fast cars, so as fast jet. So it's still the same. Women can drive fast cars. They can also drive fast jet. So yeah, that's what that
can be.
Okay. Feel about the fact that in the South African Air Force there's only 3 women who are fighter pilots. I mean, fighter pilots are those pilots that get sent on this fast plane and they go on a mission to go and shoot somewhere, then come back.
I think the government should put out more of people who should do the type of career, because there are a lot of people, South Africans, mostly South Africans, that are not working, and those who have qualifications but still they're not getting employed. I think there should be more people who should be willing to do the job. Yeah.
No, tell me, if it was in your case, would you do a job like that? This job entails going into this fast jet, you go somewhere, you carry out a mission, and you come back, and you fly very high and very fast. Tell me a bit more about if it was you who was supposed to do that job.
For me, I think I could do the job because that's not what I wish to do. That's not what I love.
Okay. Thing is ngapha kuwe How do you feel about
Okay.
How do you feel about information that out of so many millions of women in the country, only 3 are fighter pilots?
Yeah, like she said, the government maybe should,
I'll say something different.
Why don't you ask me that question, the last one?
If that position came up, and then there was that opportunity for you to apply or get that job, would you apply for that type of job? Would you take it? And if so, tell me a bit more about why do you find it thrilling?
Yes, definitely. I will take the job because, like, as we all know that a lot of people are unemployed, and I will also wanna be maybe wanna fly to other countries. Yeah, and yes.
Okay, one. Tell me if that opportunity was presented, would you take that job? And then if so, tell me why would you take a job like that?
Definitely, I will take the job because, as we all know that